Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
Hey, won't you come and see what I'm working on at the moment? As you know, I recruit audiences, and I'd like you to come and see the work in my studio. So, come on in. I'm Lynn Wolfe, Professor Emeritus from the University of Colorado. I taught at the Fine Arts Department for 36 years. I came here to Boulder in 1946. And Boulder has been one of my loves, shall I say. I've always felt that I had no choice about being an artist. I grew up in a large farmhouse in Red Cloud, Nebraska that had a stained glass window over the dining room window. And I've always wondered if that had any influence on my concerns. One of my grandfathers was the village blacksmith. I think maybe that had something to do with it. My other grandfather was a Latin scholar, a gentleman farmer who lived in this house, and he taught me to read before I went to kindergarten. So I always had an advantage over all of my fellow students because I could read so early on. I started being an artist when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I used to dig clay from the sand pits near our property. I used my dentist gave me plaster of Paris, so I was able to cast some things. I used to catch my younger brother, 4 years younger than I, and make him pose, and I draw pictures of his ear. There was no formal art program in our Red Cloud schools, but since I was valedictorian of the graduating class of 1935, I was able to go to the University of Nebraska on a scholarship. When I first arrived there, I took one class in the Fine Arts Department because I wasn't certain it was a manly thing to do. And I decided after one course that it was all right to go full blast in the art program. And the interesting thing is I had to work my way through college because this was Dust Bowl days, and the dairy farm that I grew up on failed while I was in college. And I worked for the Nebraska State Museum doing low-relief sculptures, among other things, to put back of the skeletal remains of the prehistoric animals that we had on display. So I knew more about handling plaster of Paris than my sculpture teacher did, but I was really a painter. I mean, I've always been a watercolorist, and I did so many watercolors over Christmas vacation my last year in college that the head of the department allowed me to have a one-man watercolor show in the university galleries. I was also working in digging fossils in the summertime in order to earn money to go back to school in the fall. And digging fossils, it was always interesting that we worked where there were no trees. This is painted in the center part of Wyoming. This obviously is a sheep herder's wagon. And I'm saying that we lived in tents, we lived in the wilderness, and it was the best training for going into the military. I was drafted going into World War II, but there were always plenty of subjects around. I took my paints and my drawing materials with me every place I went, and I found it sort of fun to do American soldiers, but more important, I even did the skeletal remains of the enemy in New Guinea, and another. I'm not going to show you all of these, there are too many of them, but I found that there were always military subjects that could be drawn or painted. But I'll show you now just a few of the, I mentioned doing watercolors over Christmas vacation while I was still a student. All of these are rural farm scenes and done in the wintertime when it was too cold to paint, but there wasn't as much snow as there is in Boulder at the moment. Now, while I was in the military, I was a photo intelligence officer, and fortunately I could illustrate some of the things that I found as I was studying the various targets that we, so I had advantage over some of the other photo interpreters. Whenever I travel, I have a sketchbook, and I can do a way of recording what it is I might, and I guess maybe I should say that most of my sketches I don't do anything with, but I just have to sketch while I'm traveling. Now, my wife and I have spent a lot of time in Mexico, and this is the butterfly net fisherman on one of the lakes in Mexico. For some reason, I found the Southwest absolutely fascinating, and the cathedrals, the churches that were built by the Spanish have had a special interest for me. Um, 30 years ago, I did a self-portrait, and it's hanging on the wall over there, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. These are, to me, particularly interesting because the painting down here is one that I submitted to the Hallmark International Competition and won one of the awards, and Hallmark made it as a Christmas card that year, so I had my own Christmas cards printed up. The painting at the top is one I sold to a bank, and the bank called me one time and said, "Do you mind if we use this as our Christmas card?" And I said, "Of course not, but you have to give me 25 Christmas cards." So twice I had my own Christmas card. I don't know that you can really see what this is, but it's a horse, and I titled it Runaway. And I based it on the horse that's, the rocking horse that's over in the front part of the, I enjoy labeling my things. I find it interesting that Clifford Still, who has the new Clifford Still Museum, numbered his paintings because he didn't want to give the audience any distraction from the forms that he worked with. I've done some metal work, but I can tell you that maybe I should mention right now that I'm a handicapped artist. I have vision in only one eye, and I can't do welding. I have to hire it done. But since welders are better at it than I am, all I have to do is design and furnish them with the parts to put together, and they can do it. I've done some tile work, and I would mention at this point that my family was very supportive of me being an artist. They never questioned it. My wife was particularly helpful and supportive. My 3 daughters were helpful, and 2 of them helped me do the mosaic work. In other words, they were so fascinated by being in the studio that they were, quotes, helpful. Speaking of mosaic tile, this is one that was done for a chapel in southern Nebraska. I got the vitreous tile from Mexico and learned to. I might mention that most of the work that I do, I didn't learn in school. I sort of learned by traveling and looking and reading and doing it myself. Now, even though I say I'm primarily a painter, this is a figure of Christ that's in the local cemetery, and it was done in aluminum in about 6 or 7 parts so it could be reproduced in a commercial foundry. And after it was established in the cemetery here in Boulder, the cemetery people painted it white. And I thought, oh, hell, you shouldn't do that to an artist's work. Well, I went out and looked, and it looks better white than it was when I had it in the raw metal. So it was just one of those good things that happened to me. In the living room, there's a sculpture that I call Soft Landing, and it's made of a black walnut wood pillow, which is about as hard as anything, landing in what looks like Jell-O, which is plastic material. Now, for a while, I was doing what I called the saved wax sculpture system. The original was done in wax and taken to a commercial foundry, and it had to have no undercuts so that they could do a commercial mold, and the original was saved so it could be recast the second time. I tend to cast and produce only one item, but I like to think that nobody else is doing the saved wax system. Now, when I talked about the figure of Christ, that was not a typical lost wax system, but when I get to some of the wolves, we'll talk about lost wax. For a while I've worked with plastic and walnut, and I would mention at this point that my father at one time found a bunch of black walnut timbers and put them up in his haymow in, I think, an oat bin, and cured them for a number of years and then gave them to me. So all the walnut you see around the place came from something that my father got for me. I at one point was doing some clay work. In other words, a pottery figure, and this is a system where you start at the bottom and model it as you go, and when you get to the top you're finished. And if you look back of you there are some of my favorite people, the pre-Columbian Indian clay works, which I assume are done essentially the same way. One of the things, I sold this to a bank in Denver. I started out with a farmer's disc, and I did clay work on the top of it to give it the elaboration, and had it cast in aluminum and sold it, of course. This is another clay piece. This is Cassandra, done with the coil method where you start at the bottom and end at the top. Now, in Fort Collins, if you notice, here is a picture of me. I still had hair in those days, so I was younger, and I was working on a guardian angel for the chapel on the Colorado State University campus. And I would mention that my wife made me a sandbag about the size of this table. And I put a sheet of copper about this size on it and would pound it from the back side and make the sculptured form occur on the other side. Well, when you pound copper, pretty soon it rings, and I'd have to take it out and put a torch to it and anneal it, and it'd be softened again, and then I'd pound it some more, and it would start ringing. And the problem was, it destroyed my upper register of hearing. Girls' voices I have trouble with. Men's voices usually I can get if I'm close enough to them. But I just mentioned that they're hazards in the art world that you should pay attention to. I also did a figure of Christ on the cross for the chapel. This is the way the chapel looks. I did candlesticks for the altar. This is perhaps a better picture showing what the copper looked like when it was the two angels side by side. Now, you asked if I'd done the stained glass hanging over here, and I'd say no, but I did do stained glass for St. Aidan's. And one of the things the people wanted to be able to look out into the garth, so they didn't want solid windows, they wanted hanging glass work. So I had to work with welded steel and inch-thick glass. So it has a little bit of a jewel-like quality. And this is the stained glass at the entry. I did two panels, one day of creation and one night of creation. And you should photograph it, it's okay. I also did in Denver for one of the hospitals, and I've forgotten the name, a stained glass of the phoenix, which relates to Christ's everlasting life, because the phoenix, when it's consumed in its own fire and is then emerges alive, is a Christian symbol for Christ's everlasting life. Okay. Well, I did a series of these stained glass hangings for St. Aidan's, and so I say it's worth checking out sometime. Now, my children said, why don't you do a bronze wolf for your wife's grave? So I did a bronze wolf for my wife's grave. But there's also one, my middle daughter took her own life years ago in Fort Collins, and so there's Lynn's garden, which also has a bronze wolf. If you're ever up in Steamboat Springs, there's a botanical garden that has a bronze wolf in it. And we'll be looking at a bronze wolf down in my studio. And this I find sort of an interesting picture of the different patinas that you can put on bronze. Chemically, you can get whatever color you want if you know what you're doing with it. I told you that I did for a while the saved wax system, and I've found that I don't have any of these now. They were all sold at some point. I would mention that nearly everything I do seems to have a Western quality, and my son-in-law, who lives in Steamboat Springs, gave me a cowboy hat in leather, and I thought, my gosh, it's so sculptural that I decided to do one in bronze. So when we go down to my studio, you'll see an original of this in bronze. Okay, I think this is all the things we need to look at here. Oh, I might mention, I used to have a little red fox come around to say hello to the bronze wolf. And the best response I've ever had to my bronze wolf was when a neighbor would bring the little dog over and the little dog would bark at the wolf. I thought that was a proper response. Mm-hmm. On December the 6th, 1941, I came to Denver, Colorado to visit the museum because I had thought about becoming a museum artist as a career. And I was much impressed with Denver and Colorado at that point, and I talked to a fellow by the name of Love who did the background paintings at the natural habitats in the museum, and he said we might be related. And I said, tell me more. And he said, well, his family's name was L-O-V-E, but it originally was a French name, L-O-U-P. And when they moved to England, they changed it from Wolfe to Love. And but he was just joking. And well, I went back to Red Cloud on December the 7th, 1941, and was painting a watercolor down by the Republican River. And I had my portable radio, and Pearl Harbor was attacked, and I thought, oh hell, there goes 5 years of my youth. And I mean, I was available, shall we say. Well, after serving in the military, I went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln just to say hi to the faculty, and they said, will you start teaching for us? And I said, I don't have an advanced degree. And they said, that's all right, we need you. Well, the GIs were coming back and they really needed help, so I said, well, I'll teach for 2 semesters, but I'm headed for Colorado. And I had a friend in New Guinea who told me that Boulder was a nice little city and that the university was a pleasant place where he had gone. So I applied for a graduate fellowship, and I sent a picture of my wife and me. And because she was so beautiful, they gave me the fellowship. And so I came to Boulder, and I had mentioned that I had saved $4,000 in the almost 4 years I was in the military. I started as a private, but ended up as a captain. And I bought a house for $3,750 cash, which was a stupid thing to do. I should have bought 3 houses. But I didn't. I did later, however. I want to mention the fact that the University of Colorado had a delightful visiting artists program where every summer we had an important artist come here. Boulder being a pleasant place to live in the summertime, we had no trouble getting important artists. And one summer, I was, as a graduate student, was able to study under Max Beckmann, who was one of the most important German painters, internationally known, fantastically important artist. I was just lucky to be there when he was here. Then later, when I became an instructor at the university, I was able to get a faculty fellowship to go to Paris and study under Osip Zadkine, who was a internationally known Cubist sculptor who originally had come from Russia. He was a Russian Jew, and unfortunately he spoke fluent English, so I didn't get to practice my French in his classes because he always, all the students said he spoke English in the classes. But it was a very important time. We spent about 3 months in Paris and 3 months traveling, and later I got another fellowship where well, in fact, what I did, I was chosen to give the research lecture, which automatically gives you a year off with pay, and we spent another 6 months traveling into Europe. We bought a squareback Volkswagen and had 3 daughters, and were never mistaken for Americans because Americans don't travel with little kids. And we actually had a wonderful time. The girls didn't like going to hotels because they had to be ladylike, so they said, let's buy a tent and camp in the campground. So we camped all over Europe. We traveled about 20,000 miles in a squareback Volkswagen and had one problem with a windshield wiper during that time. And I can tell you one of the good things about traveling early on, we went over on the Queen Mary and came back on the Queen Elizabeth. And it's just traveling by ocean liner is the way to go. I might mention that I went to the South Pacific on a luxury liner, a Matson liner, but there were twice as many passengers as usual because they were all soldiers. So I've had some interesting travel time and opportunities for looking at things. I might mention that when I was about 10 years old, I read a book called Digging in Yucatan and decided I wanted to be an artist with an archaeological dig. You can see I have this, I was always the artist, but it changes from museum to archaeology to whatever. And it was written by Mrs. Earl Morris. Well, years later, when I came to the University of Colorado, I signed up for anthropology as my minor. And Earl Morris was my instructor. And I thought, wow, isn't this interesting that I was able to make contact. And one of the people who was written about in the book Digging in Yucatan was a French artist who later came to Colorado Springs to head the art department there and came up to Boulder one time to give a lecture. In those days, I was the young person who was chauffeur. Anyone who came, I had to drive them around, and I drove him around town and so forth. And he was so pleased with his stay in Boulder that he sent me a print, which I really should show you as we travel around. And I thought, isn't it interesting how you can come full circle with these things? Just reading a book, and when I'm young and making contact with all the people that were in the book. And I made a mistake later in life. I should have bought Earl Morris's house, which is over on 5th Street, and I didn't. Although I can't complain about my current quarters, I always say that this is not a bad house for a frugal school teacher. This is one of the saved wax systems, which I can go to make use of a commercial foundry. And I thought during the atomic threat that what would be a better symbol than a singed angel. And the title of this is The Last Trumpet. And I find the title is so good, it's almost better than the sculpture. Now this one, I would mention the technique is strange. I start out with styrofoam. Styrofoam is easy to carve and shape and so forth. And you take it to a commercial foundry and they put it into a sand mold. So this is called the cavity-less mold system. There's never a void. In other words, the thing fills the mold. And then they pour hot metal into that, and the styrofoam evaporates. And I think becomes toxic, so I don't do this anymore. But anyway, it's a different sculpture system. Okay. Years ago, my wife and I traveled to Alamos, Mexico. It's a silver mining town in northern Mexico. And we were staying in a hotel, and we heard the announcement, all Americans are invited to Dr. So-and-so's house. You can tell I don't remember the doctor's name, but the fact that we were able to go to breakfast, we were both frugal school teachers and never turned down an invitation to a free meal. And we went to this doctor's house, and I was so impressed with the Spanish architecture detail. The window in its conformation is so fascinating, and looking out on the cathedral. So this is Easter Sunday Alamos. And this is acrylic on canvas. And I might mention that very often I photograph or sketch, and then I come home and tell a lie. I use my own color systems, I exaggerate, I intensify whatever I want to bring the message of what I recall and what I experienced. This is a black walnut pillow, and this is polyester resin. And the polyester resin looks like Jell-O, so I entitled this Soft Landing. I don't think this really challenges you, but that's something I had to do. Now, more interesting to me is the fact that I've got a painting here that includes a lace curtain and 3 butterflies, and the title fascinates me because I call it We Three Kings. I'm a watercolorist, and if you come in here you can see I've got a stack of watercolors about this thick. I think my kids would like me to sell some paintings. My only concern is I'm running out of space, so I may have to. Now, I think of myself as a colorist. If you see something of this sort, I say color has energy, and whether you respond to it or not, you can't deny it because it keeps doing something. Now, I would ask you to, if you can photograph, in here is a painting I call Pacific, and I can tell you that I've traveled the Pacific by boat, I've traveled it by air. I taught at the University of Hawaii for a semester years ago, and I just needed to do a painting of the Pacific in a watercolor technique, even though it's acrylic on canvas. And if you could photograph this pile of watercolors, here you can see that I've been busy. This is a rather simple painting, but I swear that it does things. There are certain color relationships there that beckon and push and pull, and in many ways I think this is based on my canyon experience. For some reason, everything I do, my non-objective, the abstract paintings seem to relate to landscapes and very often to canyons. And so I'm just saying, I enjoy looking at this thing and playing with the colors, and I hope that you find it acceptable in your own view. Now let's move over to a self-portrait on the far wall. This painting was done, this is acrylic on canvas, and was done 30 years ago. And I call it a family portrait. And the reason I do, my eldest daughter made me the decorative device on the cowboy hat. My youngest daughter gave me the cowboy hat. My middle daughter gave me the silver belt buckle, and my wife made me the gin and tonic. I've enjoyed paintings of the Southwest, and this is Santuario De Chimayo, and it's a delightful small church in New Mexico. It used to have cottonwoods on either side, but the cottonwoods are gone, but I continue to paint cottonwood in front because I like the idea of it framing it. But I've got a color problem. It isn't quite what I want, so I've put it up here where I can watch it. And I think the problem has to do with some of the pinks in the foreground area and maybe the strength of the sky. I've got a gentle little bit. For the building itself is properly done, but there's something in the environment that doesn't satisfy me. So I just wanted to mention that I sometimes live with my paintings in order to see what it is I should be doing. And this again is acrylic on canvas, which I can paint over. It isn't the problem of watercolor on paper. Okay, and as you come down the stairs, you might notice that I have a wood carving panel from New Guinea. I have a Northwest Coast Indian sculpture. I have a black palm carving from Dutch New Guinea. And these things are important to me to live with. I call this Call of the Wild, and it's a gray wolf, even though in bronze it's green. I mentioned earlier that my daughter suggested I do a bronze wolf for my wife's grave in Red Cloud, Nebraska. So that sort of got me going doing wolves. I might mention that this is cast in Loveland in the bronze services company of Loveland, and it's the lost wax system. I would mention that I started out with a styrofoam sculpture close to the size of this, and styrofoam being fragile is easy to carve and shape, but then I cover it with plaster and cheesecloth and it becomes light and strong, and then I cover that with oil clay to get the detail and take that to the foundry, and they make a rubber mold from the original positive, and then they coat that with a plaster, or I should say ceramic material, to keep the rubber mold from distorting, and then they paint into that about 1/4 inch thick wax, and once that's accomplished they are able to then fire the whole thing in a kiln, and the wax melts out and it's lost. This weighs 70 pounds, and I think I can show you that it is hollow, so that it looks like it weighs a lot, but it only weighs 70 pounds. Now I'm starting to work on a newer, bigger one, and I've got an electric device that I can do delineation. I want to make a very rough textural effect, even though I have generally smooth form. And any of you sculptors, I would recommend that you don't use wax. It's twice as hard to work with as the oil clay. I light a candle, and then I heat my several different tools with the candle, and then I shape and this will go to the foundry, and they'll make the rubber mold and the mother mold, and proceed with the lost wax technique. Everything I do seems to be Western. When my son-in-law gave me this hat, I just said, oh boy, that's sculptural, I'd rather do something with it. So I did this in oil clay, which is easy to model and shape and so forth. The structure underneath is styrofoam and plaster and cheesecloth, as I mentioned, but this is a bronze casting, which I'm still working on. I'm doing a little cleanup on it. It was was outdoor this morning with ice on it, so I had to bring it inside to have it for you people to look at. Anyway, this is the Westerner. I think of myself as a watercolorist, and this is one of my favorite watercolors, and I use a technique here where I paint and I press things down and I lift them off so that I get a certain quality of surface texture that most people don't even try to get in a watercolor. But anyway, all these little brass things I get from Goodwill and other places, and I enjoy having them on my mantelpiece. This is an acrylic painting which is now on loan to the local hospital for the next 12 months. And interesting enough, for 3 years it had been in Athens in the ambassador's house. I might mention that I'm not high-tech, but my daughter, who's an artist in Chicago, put one of my paintings online, and the ambassador to Greece saw it and asked if he could have it in his house. This is part of a program that the State Department sponsors of letting artists have their work on display in a far country. So this is entitled Into the Canyon. I've been lucky. My profession, my life has been something of my choosing, not someone else's. I was lucky to have the most beautiful wife in the world. My children are always well behaved and helpful. My grandchildren, I tell people, are so remarkable that if I'd known I would have had more of them. I've been lucky in my work. I've been lucky in my associates. I have friends who come and visit. I just have had a good life. And every day is a miracle when you're 97. Hey, thank you for coming. I really appreciate your visiting and coming to my studio and seeing what I'm working on. As you know, I recruit audiences, so I'm so very pleased that you came. So thank you very much.